My first taste of the nonprofit sector was when I was 12. I decided, naturally as any 12-year-old does, to start an organization to address some issues that I cared deeply about. I quickly immersed myself in Edmonton's feminist community. Believe it or not, we have one. And I decided to start an organization called Ophelia's Voice. Ophelia's Voice was meant to help young women in Edmonton and Alberta cultivate their leadership potential. People often ask me where the name came from, Ophelia's Voice, the things that you think of when you're 12. I mean, it seemed like a good idea at the time. When I was 12, I picked up a book in my local library. It was called Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls. It's a weird book, really. It was written in the 80s by a psychologist who talks about how young women are often kind of victims to their own experience. So they really face a lot of challenges around body image, their security with their own bodies, healthy sexuality, the influence of the media, that kind of thing. So it was a scary book. I picked it up when I was 12, and I was encouraged to change the conversation about young women to one of leadership potential and civic engagement instead of victimization. The organizational structure of Ophelia's Voice was particularly interesting too. Since I wasn't legally able to own my own organization, I had to recruit some adult allies to help me govern the organization. We had a group of adult women as a board. We had a group of younger women mentors, and all of the programming was planned and facilitated by girls. While I'm still active in the feminist community now in Toronto, I'm particularly passionate about another issue, and that's how we think about the nonprofit and charitable sector in Canada. While I was involved in Ophelia's Voice, I reflected a lot on the constraints that we often place in the nonprofit sector. Things like a lack of job security, very unsustainable funding models. We often prevent nonprofits from advocating on policy that's relevant to their work. An important current example of this, if you're not familiar, is Bill C-38, which is silencing a lot of environmental groups across the country to really kind of make a statement on the issues that they know best. And this is raising questions across the sector about how nonprofits are supposed to engage with government. I also realize that we often hold nonprofits to higher standards of accountability than we do Fortune 500 companies. So I want to talk about a few things today. I want to talk about community organizing, I want to talk about the nonprofit sector, and I want to talk about how our generation is at a critical juncture in how we think about social good. Mainly, I want to talk to you about how we need to change the conversation about nonprofits and charities in Canada. So why does it even matter? And to who does this matter? Is this an issue that only I seem to care about? I would argue that most of you in the audience donate to nonprofits and charities often. Some of you might work for them. We probably all at some point in our lives sit on boards. We advocate for causes that we believe in. We hope that the social issues that we care so much about will one day be eradicated. Things like poverty, maybe gender inequality. When we include hospitals and universities in the equation, Canada's nonprofit sector accounts for 7% of our national GDP. I'd argue that it's a feminist issue too. 84% of the nonprofit workforce is women, and it's a highly undervalued and underpaid profession. So I'd like to frame this conversation around 4 questions that I've encountered in my own work. I hope to have an honest conversation with you about how we create barriers to a healthy, vibrant, and sustainable social sector. I hope to convince you that this isn't an individualized problem, so it's not the fault of the communities in need or the organizations that can't pay to keep their doors open. I'm going to argue that it's a collective problem and one that we all need to take responsibility for. So I'll take you to my first question. How do we rebuild trust in nonprofits and charities? Public trust in the financial oversight of charities is certainly on the decline. So when we hope to donate, we often look for the organizations that have the lowest administrative costs. It turns into a race towards the bottom. We don't often reflect on whether we give these organizations enough capacity to truly reflect on how they do things, the solutions that they want to approach a social issue with, or if they truly have the capacity to pay their staff well, if they can really think through what they're doing and constantly reevaluate their approach. So this is an important question because it begs the question, are accountability and efficiency bad? Do we instead go in the favor of giving nonprofits and charities just this money to kind of explore and to think about innovative approaches? I'd argue that accountability and efficiency aren't bad. but I really think that we need to be critical in evaluating how we fund organizations and how we give them that license to truly explore new and creative approaches to how we address these really complex social issues instead of constraining their ability to survive. My second question is, how do we make room for failure in the social sector? Engineers Without Borders famously releases a report called their Failure Report every year, which details which of their international projects in the last year have failed, why, and how they plan to improve. This kind of document is publicly available, and it's really changing the charitable discourse. It's making us think about how we position nonprofits and charities to truly experience that failure as it comes. I'd argue that in the corporate sector, we allow for this much more. Things like bailouts, maybe, or the kind of supportive culture that we give entrepreneurs and startups. One failure that I'd like us to collectively admit is our current model of funding nonprofits and charities. I'm sure you'll agree with me. When we ask nonprofit sector professionals, and I say professionals because their skill set is a valuable one, to write grants year after year to pay themselves, that's hardly an efficient way of us achieving the social change that we need. I was pleasantly surprised to hear Premier Alison Redford address a very keen audience of nonprofit leaders several weeks ago. She apologized for being part of a government that contracts social service provision to the nonprofit sector without the sustainable funding or the job security that they need. I remember when Ophelia's Voice received its first grant. I was 14. Grant by grant, we sustained an organization for 5 years that reached over 500 young women across the province and helped 10 young women launch sustainable, long-term, community-based action projects. Reflecting on the funding mechanisms behind our work, I realized that short-term grants are no way to fund long-term social change. So this leads me to my third question. How do we finance social change in a sustainable way? Some of you in the audience might beg to differ with me, but I would suggest that social enterprise isn't the only way of doing this. When we ask charities to create products, to participate in the marketplace, and to try and generate self-sustaining income for themselves, we're denying the real issue at play. I do think there's a lot of interesting opportunities for hybrid models that do allow nonprofits to ease that kind of reliance that we currently have on donations, grants, and subsidies, and to allow corporations to truly embed a social bottom line in the way that they do business. However, I would argue that the ultimate investment needs to come from elsewhere. In my lifetime, I hope to see a substantive government investment in our communities the same way I see us investing in natural resources, science, or technology. It comes down to the way the nonprofit sector works as a system. We can't keep operating this way. Nonprofit organizations proliferate, we compete for the same resources, we struggle to collaborate in a meaningful way, and we really challenge them to think through how they sustain themselves in a meaningful way. We simply can't keep doing it this way. I'm tired of hearing that organizations need to reinvent themselves, reorient their strategy, chase the dollars that fund the sexiest social issues, or adapt to our current climate of austerity. I think especially in Edmonton and especially in Alberta, it's a conversation about prosperity. It just depends on how that's being used. I don't think asking organizations to change is the answer. I think it's at a systems level, and I think it's fundamentally about how we choose priorities in our democracy. I've had the privilege of watching some really interesting models take shape in Toronto, where I've lived for the last 3 years. Models like the Centre for Social Innovation, which is a space that houses hundreds of nonprofits. It's a beautiful, collaborative space. It forces these organizations that work on vastly different social issues to have conversations on a daily basis about how they can collaborate better. I've also been one of the founding members of a Toronto-based network of younger nonprofit leaders. We have powerful conversations at the sector level about things like social finance, things like mentorship, succession planning, how we mentor younger nonprofit leaders who are interested in taking on these leadership roles. We've also started a documentary film project where we interview soon-to-retire nonprofit leaders who were active in the social justice movements of the 1960s to have them reflect on what they've learned and how they want to see the sector transform. So this leads me to my fourth question, and it's one that's closer to my heart. How do we know when organizations are ready to die? This is a question that I reflected deeply on in the spring of 2009 when I let Ophelia's Voice do just that. It's a difficult question, but an important one. People often ask me what's left of Ophelia's Voice. What was kind of the legacy that we put forward? I tell them that we left several hundred radically feminist books in my local library with Ophelia's Voice bookplates in them that I hope other 12-year-old girls will one day pick up and be inspired to change the world in their own way. In a less tangible way, there's now a community of girls, young women, and community organizations here in Edmonton who are committed to applying a gender lens to the way that they think about social issues. This is significant. So why didn't I make more of an effort to sustain the organization? Do those kind of traditional things that we think of, make a succession plan, mentor someone else, kind of recruit someone else to take on the leadership of the organization? I think it comes down to the question of organizations can't and shouldn't last forever. When we apply this approach of sustainability for the sake of sustainability, we're often not truly reflecting on whether the solutions that we're proposing to address the social issues that we care about truly are effective, or if the issues and the need that we're looking to address still even exists. It's a very important question, and it's a really difficult one for us in the sector, since we see organizations last for 60, 70 years. I think the way of the future is less in the way of these traditional nonprofit social service organizations and more in the way of kind of more loose, citizen-driven, lateral networks that respond to specific calls to action. I have an example for you. It's an organization that I currently sit on the board of in Toronto. It's called Frontline Partners with Youth Network. They started in 2005 in response to the Year of the Gun in Toronto, which was a really traumatic year in terms of youth gun violence. So if you think about this, this is a network of frontline youth workers, which is a hugely undervalued and underpaid profession, but has an enormous amount of responsibility for responding to things like gang violence, gang involvement, youth gun violence, youth employment, that kind of thing. So it's a hugely underrepresented community, and the fact that they can collaborate together to advocate on policy that affects the environments that they work in is really significant. If you saw in the news recently about the Eaton Centre shootings, you'll understand why this is kind of a conversation that Canada needs to keep having. So the questions that we must ask kind of lead into a conversation about the leadership that we need. This kind of brings us to a concept called the leadership deficit in the nonprofit sector. It's an idea where when the baby boomers start to retire, there's all these kind of leadership gaps that we're not able to fill. Statistics vary, but they seem to suggest that 3 out of 4 nonprofit leaders are leaving their jobs in the next 5 years due to retirement or burnout. These same statistics suggest that my generation is either not interested or not adequately prepared to take on these positions. I'd first argue that it isn't a leadership deficit. I couldn't be more proud of the exciting and innovative work that is being done by young people across the country. I think there's a lot of room for us to think more closely about innovation, about how we do things differently, about how we change the systems that we're so frustrated by. There's a lot of buzz about concepts like entrepreneurship, where we innovate from the inside of large and bureaucratic organizations, or solutions to these social problems that cross the boundaries of government, nonprofit, and corporate. The ultimate question here is, how do we make this work? I'm suggesting something that doesn't quite make sense, is going to require some radical systems change. So how do we truly make this work? We're in a volatile economy, and my generation is facing even scarier job prospects. What we don't need is more short-term, unstable contract work that doesn't allow us to make a true living working in the sector that we love. What we need is good, long-term, stable jobs that allow us to build the social infrastructure that we need long-term. This, too, is going to require an investment. So I want to end with a bit of a call to action. I'm asking for ownership rather than engagement. What I'm asking for is going to require a level of personal and collective responsibility that hasn't been seen before. It's going to require us to sit in the complexity, to take profound risks, to experience the inevitable failure that follows from those risks, and to truly invest in changing these broken systems. We need to dare to do things differently. We need to not be content with the status quo. We need to not continue contributing to this rhetoric of young people are the leaders of tomorrow. I don't buy it. We all have a role to play in reimagining how we develop and support our communities. It takes every single one of us. So when we think about this, and we think about what it's really going to truly take to accomplish this, I think the bottom line is that how we value the nonprofit sector is ultimately a reflection of how much we value the democracy that we live in and our fellow citizens, how much we care about them. Thank you.